Blake mentioned. So I'm going to do this little garden tour. Does that sound good? And I'll talk to you about some of the things Blake mentioned in addition to a few other things. So I'm going to turn me around so you see the garden and not me. So this garden is about 4 years old. It is the view from the back of our house, and we look out at this. And almost all of our plants are native. Can everybody hear me okay? Is everybody good?
Yes.
Okay. Almost all of the plants are native. If you take a look here, this is a black-eyed Susan or Rudbeckia, and there's actually, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a pollinator right there. Do you see it? Actually, that might be a baby dragonfly. Oh my gosh. Anyway, this is a cardinal flower, which attracts hummingbirds, but it also attracts other types of bees, I believe, with long tongues. And then we also have the cone flowers, which I'm going to sneak up on these guys. You can see them in action. There's a couple different kinds. I'm not sure if you saw them. And here's a, sorry, they're like, get away from me. But the cone flowers and also the different Rudbeckias really attract a lot of insects. And when it comes to Blake, you mentioned crowding the plants. That's kind of my style. As you can see, it's all like grown together. I really like it because they actually hold each other up. They tend not to flop so much. And I think they look beautiful, all the colors combined. This is a non-native hydrangea, and it's absolutely gorgeous, and it takes up a lot of space with the big purple and pink blooms, but I never see insects on the blooms. So that's an example of a non-native plant that isn't really that helpful ecologically. I keep it for selfish purposes because I like how it looks, but it would probably be better if I replaced it with something that would actually serve wildlife and not just my aesthetic needs and wants. But that's okay. Just to do a little walk around, we are going to talk about specialist bees. Oh, look, there's a wasp. Oh, they moved. This is Heuchera americana, or alum root. And this is a variety that's a different color. But if you do the straight species, there is a specialist bee that needs the nectar from the flowers in order to rear its young. And then this is also a plant that has specialist bees that depend on it. It's called Coreopsis. It's really pretty. There's some yellow versions, some pink versions, some mixed color versions. Here's another color. It's like a red color. And then Blake, you mentioned your switchgrass. I have noticed the exact same thing with my switchgrass when it's all kind of dead and beyond. Not only do I see things using the stems, but I also see birds using the dead leaves to build nests, which is really neat. And then another host plant would be spicebush, which, if you're familiar with spicebush swallowtail, and if you look at all the leaves, traditional gardeners will say, oh no, something is eating my leaves, and they'll try to kill the insects. But with the sort of new way of thinking, I see something eating the leaves and I say, yay, and I sort of celebrate because that means it's actually being used. Here's an example of a leaf cutter bee cutout. So some native leaf cutter bee actually took chunks out of my leaves so that they could go line nests, which I think is pretty awesome. And then if you're doing a home garden, you can do pretty things like this, like make a little path and have a place to sit. Blake, I can't remember if you mentioned a brush pile, but this is our brush pile. We just basically throw our sticks and different things there, and it looks like something's living in there too, which is pretty neat. And just going through back to the computer, we've got some really neat cultivar for coneflower. And then I also have literally just logs. This is not a tree stump that's in the ground. This is just something I found on the side of the road and brought because I wanted a stump for bees to burrow in and also to put cool decorations on. But that's a little tour of my garden. Hey, Blake, do you think you could put my presentation up? And
all right, Liz, you're good to go.
Okay, I see it. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk about pollinator specialists and ecological gardening and how they go together. If you noticed with the little garden tour, there's a lot of specific plants that I put because they serve certain needs. And then sometimes I pick plants just because they're pretty, but I try to go the other way more. But I'm going to show you some details. Blake, if you could go to the next slide, please. So Blake already discussed, what is a pollinator, and I just wanted to reiterate that bats. There's a little specialist bee in the middle picture up top. And then, of course, we've got monarchs helping to pollinate a Joe Pye weed. And I believe that's a milkweed beetle on the bottom left, and then some sort of wasp on the right. But all of these things help pollinate. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the pollination helps lead to fertilization in many cases. And I just wanted to show you sort of the before and after of some of the flowers. The purple coneflower, or Latin name Echinacea, turns into this sort of spiky dome that you can see the goldfinch on, which at first I thought, oh, that is just so ugly. It just looks dead. But when I saw the goldfinches eating it, I thought, oh, actually, that's really beautiful because it brings goldfinches to my yard. So I've changed my opinion on the seed heads. And the second one, blue false indigo, you can actually rattle the seeds on the right. It's pretty neat. It sounds like an instrument. And Blake had mentioned redbud, the bottom left. Those beautiful purple flowers turn into what look like beans. And then the chokeberry is just wonderful all around. A bonus for that aesthetically, for, we want to see beautiful things, is that the leaves turn bright red in the fall. So that's a really good bonus. But aside from us wanting pretty things and birds eating the seeds and all that, there is actually another big reason why we need these native plants that have evolved here for millennia. Next slide, please. So native bees need native plants. Native bees are essentially bees that have been evolving in a particular area for us in North America for thousands to millions of years, and they've adapted to certain plants in specific ways. And in some cases, they can only use the nectar or pollen from very specific flowers. Next slide, please. So native bee species by the numbers, there are approximately 4,000 native bee species in North America. And we are starting to learn about them, but we still have a lot to learn, a lot to go. And 25% of all native bees are specialists, which again means that they depend on a specific species for survival. And I'll show you some examples. Next slide, please. So this is the woodland sunflower, Helianthus divaricatus. By the way, when you see the Latin names, don't be intimidated. I mispronounce them all the time. I asked an expert at Mount Cuba Center where I work, and they're all big experts. What's the trick to pronouncing Latin names? And she said, it's a dead language that no one actually speaks, so it doesn't matter how you pronounce it as long as you get all the pieces in there. So don't be, don't shy away from the Latin. It's actually really important to know those things if you're really going to get into it. Anyway, the woodland sunflower, is relied upon by the three cute little bees that you see on the bottom. I just think they're adorable. Adrena accepta, Adrena helianthi, and Melisodes agilis. I mean, look at the third one. I just want to pet it. But these absolutely depend on the woodland sunflower. And if the woodland sunflower are not growing in a vicinity, it can't do anything to reproduce. And I'll get more into that. Next slide, please. Another example, same idea. Goldenrod, which, as Blake said, supports, I think it's over 100 different species that lay their eggs on it. Some of them are Coletes. I don't know if that's correct, but I'm just going to say it. Coletes simulans, Adrena asteris, and Adrena plicata. They all must have goldenrod to reproduce and continue the species. Next, please. Thank you. So types of nesting bee or types of bees, 70% of native bee species are called minor bees or ground nesting bees. So that's really the large majority of it. And if you look at the next slide, there is a diagram of what some of the ground nests look like. So if you, I have a few words written on the left, just so you can, I like to see words typed out. It helps me remember things. There's a bunch of lightning bugs flying around me. So the brood cell is basically the little cell or section where you see the blow up, like the close up picture there. The little jelly looking worm is the larva or the baby that has hatched. And the ball, that orange ball, is a pollen loaf. So basically what happens is the female goes and finds nectar and pollen from the specific flower that she needs. It has to be a specific flower when you're talking about a bee specialist. And she kneads it together just like she's making bread. And then puts it in a chamber that she digs out all on her own. And then, well, sometimes some bees do work together, but most of them are solitary. But anyway, she lays the egg on the pollen loaf, and when the egg hatches, the food is just ready and waiting. And if you look at the chambers of the big picture, there's like little white walls, kind of. They actually seal off each chamber, because if they didn't, the larvae, they're just acting on instinct. They would crawl out and eat each other or, wiggle out and go away from their food and not have anything to eat. So that's why it's a cell that's closed off. Next slide, please. And these are just some things that I thought were cool. So bumblebees are a type of native bee that nest in the ground. They have different sized tongues, which I was going to go into some detail, but Blake actually covered that. The tongue size and shape are very important for the flowers they use. And a lot of bumblebees do have queens and like groups working together. Some of them are nectar robbers. So instead of doing what they're supposed to do, which is to provide a pollination service of going inside of the flower and moving around and getting all the pollen stuck to its hair and then going and pollinating, it actually pokes a hole at the base of the flower and steals the nectar, which is kind of hilarious to me. But it's they do that, some of them. And then they also, Blake, if you could go to the next slide, they have what's called buzz pollination, which essentially means that they go up to the flower, and for the flower to be pollinated, it needs to be shaken. So they go up to the flower and they go, ooh, and they buzz around, and they buzz their wings really fast, and they kind of vibrate the flower basically. And that's how they get the pollen off. So that's how a lot of bumblebees do pollination, is by buzz pollinating. And if you look at the next slide, that's a picture of nectar robbing. You can see this bee, this little guy, has drilled a hole in the base of the flower and is sucking the nectar out without ever pollinating it. So that's cheating, but some of them do that. If you could go to the next one, please. So the other kind, we talked briefly about ground nesters, is cavity nesting bees. And Blake had some great points about leaving the stems up. And this is one reason why. So in the fall and the winter, when all the plants die back, they look for some kind of hole, like a tubular area, so they can drill a hole and make these nests. So with the picture on the left, the the fourth chamber with sort of that is it's actually developing to be a pretty mature bee. It's getting there. The one to the left of it, just that has that brown thing, that is a pollen loaf that was never eaten because presumably the egg failed and never hatched. So that's actually a great opportunity to see what the pollen loaf looks like in real life. And then to the left of that is one that's less mature, and so on and so forth. And then the photo on the right is a bee sealing it, basically. So they make all these chambers and seal it up for protection. Now, if you clear out all your stems and you throw them away in the garbage bag, which some people do, I don't understand that, but at least like throw them in a pile. Maybe they can be compost, or some people actually set the stems upright in a little holder. Like they use like a tomato cage type thing, and they cut the stems and they stick them in the holder so they're upright. And that's a way that you can provide nests, but have it kind of over on the other area. Or if you don't care about it being messy, you can just leave it. Next slide, please. So this is another example of a cavity nesting bee. Instead of doing it in a like a stem, they actually drill into wood. I know there was a carpenter bee that drilled holes in my mailbox, and you could see little sawdust at the bottom, and it had this nest. And then there were some really huge holes, and it turned out that a woodpecker had found the carpenter bee nest and pecked it all out so they could get to the nest. So there's the circle of life. I thought that was really neat. Next slide, please. Mason bees nest in cavities, and they can be metallic blue, black, or green. They actually have scissor-like jaws, so they can gather mud and pulp and leaves. They really work hard at making their nests. And apparently, I was reading up on them. They can be really gentle. Like, you can be a beekeeper of native bees and deal with the bees without wearing protective gear. You can handle them. The males don't even have stingers, and then the females do have stingers, but they're very docile and they don't tend to sting. And even if they do, it doesn't hurt that bad. It's just like a poke. So this one's called horn-faced bee, Osmia cornifrons, which I like that name. Next slide, please. Leafcutter bees nest in cavities, just like I mentioned. So, but I love this picture I found. It cut a piece of leaf, just like I showed you the little circular thing cut out in the tree, and they fly carrying these leaves, which I imagine is kind of hard. And they line the tubes with the leaves, and then they do their sections in their cavities, and that's how they do that. So my favorite animal that I've ever seen is a leafcutter ant, which do something similar in the Amazon rainforest. So the leafcutter bee is next up, I think. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, bee habitat is declining just because of overuse of pesticides and herbicides and habitat destruction, development. Some things are hard to avoid, like development, but maybe we can take measures that take into account the existence of bees and trying to help them out. But I like this picture. Looks like he's been rolling around in the pollen, probably has been. Next slide, please. So these are just a brief list of ways that you can help directly, and then I'll finish up. So one thing you can do is plant native plants, whether it be in your own yard, at your school, which is happening at my daughter's school, and at my request, and sort of I've been leading it, is removing all of the invasive plants and adding in all these native plants that are particularly of interest from September to May, because I want it to be interesting while the students are in. Or the neighborhood. Maybe you have, maybe you can join your maintenance corporation or your HOA, or write them a letter saying, hey, we have this big grassy area or this entrance that could be so beautiful with a bunch of pollinators, and it could be part of a neighborhood initiative led by students, which is always a great thing. Next slide, please. I have an ant on me. Okay. The next thing is leaving stumps. I showed you in my own garden. I love using dead wood for that very reason. Anytime you see a hole in the dead wood, it's most likely from some sort of insect that's making a nest in there. And then at some point, that insect might become food for something, which is good too, because then you're going through the food chain. Next slide, please. Brush piles. Some people don't like this because they think it looks messy, but if you have a property where you have kind of the forgotten areas, or it doesn't really matter because you never look at it, or maybe you have like some more land in a more wild area where you don't have a lot of neighbors, or maybe your neighbors don't care, or maybe you don't care if your neighbors like it. Brush piles are always a good thing for wildlife, not only for mammals, but also for the insects. And next slide, please. It can be as simple as providing empty bamboo sticks. I really like this picture because they just kind of shoved the sticks into a crack. Usually I see these like fancy bee houses like what Blake mentioned, but I like how they just kind of piled them there. It's like super DIY, super easy, and then or you can make it really cool and get artistic, which is nice too. As in the next slide. You can make or buy a bee house. And the next slide, please. This is an example of what I was saying about the dead stems. I used to look at this, which is dead coneflower or echinacea, and go, oh, it's so messy. But when you see all the bird activity and fall and throughout winter, and in this area just going crazy for the seeds, it is not ugly. It's a thing of beauty. And also, when it snows and the snow kind of piles on top of each little seed head, it's really pretty. I think it's really important to kind of have a shift of what's beautiful. You know, is it always like perfect and manicured, or is it something that's deeper and more of like process that makes it beautiful, if that makes sense? And next slide, please. Leaving bare soil, south facing generally, that's well drained. This is just a bare patch of dirt with some rocks, but you can see all the little holes in the ground that were made by presumably bees or some other type of insect. And they're doing their thing. They're living their lives under there. And, you know, rather than coming through and saying, hey, we're going to plant, you know, thick grass here, or we've got to put like black plastic with mulch or something like that, leave it bare and let the animals have their space too. Next, please. Stopping or limiting pesticide use. You know, I see these posts on social media that say, oh my gosh, I saw a bee, or I saw a wasp. How do I kill it? What do you recommend? And I'm always the person that's posting, let it live. It's just minding its own business. It's not trying to move in with you. You know, it's just next to your house or something. Just leave them alone. Unless there really is truly a problem, leave them alone, let them be. And let them be. And then next slide, please. You can make a difference in your yard. So that's, and then there's just one more slide of resources. But that's the point of all this work that I do in the garden that I showed you. If you wanna.
Thank you so much, Liz. Those are excellent resources, good points. I have a pile of, I hadn't even considered, I have a brush pile in my backyard, but it kind of just, you know, came up. So I feel really proud of my brush pile now. Thank you so much.
You know, a lot of the ecological gardening